The courthouse doors swung shut behind him with a heavy groan, the kind of sound that clung to old buildings and older memories. Eli Barrett paused on the steps, the paper folded in his hand, still warm from the clerk's ink. It was nothing more than a few scrawled lines and an official seal, but it might as well have been a key to another life. $1. That was all it had taken. A single coin dropped into the palm of the county clerk, and suddenly a ranch that had sat abandoned for years belonged to him. He could feel the weight of the deed more than the weight of the dollar he had parted with, though both seemed almost unreal in the late morning light. Across the street, men leaned against the hitching post outside the feed store, their laughter drifting across the road like burrs on the wind. He didn't need to hear the words to know what they were saying. Everyone in town had an opinion about the Dollar Ranch, as folks called it. Haunted by misfortune, some said. Cursed ground, said others. A place where cattle sickened, crops withered, and debts multiplied faster than you could tally them in a ledger. Eli kept his gaze straight ahead and ignored their smirks, but the back of his neck burned all the same. He tucked the deed carefully into his coat pocket, smoothing it flat as though the act could make it more real. His boots found the dust of the street, worn heels clicking against stone before sinking into soft earth. He walked with the measured pace of a man who had learned not to rush hope, because hope was fragile and broke easily when handled without care. Every step carried him farther from the courthouse and closer to the choice he had made, a choice that already set him apart from the other men who muttered and spat behind his back. The truth was, Eli hadn't bought the ranch out of foolishness. He bought it because he needed something solid to his name. After years of drifting from one job to another, breaking horses in Montana, hauling freight in Wyoming, fencing for wages that never stretched far enough, he was tired of living in the cracks of other men's lives. A ranch, even a broken one, meant permanence. It meant land beneath his boots that wouldn't vanish with the next payroll or the whim of a foreman. It meant maybe, just maybe, he could build something lasting in a world that had so far offered him little more than temporary shelter. Still, as the courthouse faded behind him and the low murmur of the townsfolk's laughter followed like an echo, he wondered if they were right. The ranch had stood empty for years, its last owner leaving in the dead of night, with debts chasing him across county lines. Fences were said to sag, roofs to leak, and fields to yield nothing but stubborn weeds. Yet Eli couldn't bring himself to believe in curses. Land was land, and land could be worked. Sweat, patience, and a steady hand could coax life out of even the most reluctant soil. That was the faith he carried as he swung into his saddle and turned his horse toward the western hills. The road stretched long and lonely ahead, cutting through fields browned by neglect. Sagebrush rattled in the breeze, and the horizon shimmered with heat that rose off the earth in restless waves. As Eli rode, he let the quiet settle over him, the rhythm of hoofbeats steadying the thoughts that tumbled through his head. He imagined rows of corn standing tall again, cattle grazing in pastures free of dust, smoke rising from a chimney that had gone too long cold. He imagined silence giving way to the sounds of live chickens scratching, windmills creaking, the lowing of calves at dusk. When the outline of the ranch house finally rose against the sky, it looked even more weary than he remembered. The roof sagged like tired shoulders, shutters flapped loose on rusted hinges, and the porch leaned dangerously toward the ground. It was a place most men would ride past without a second glance, a shell of a home that seemed ready to collapse into the earth that grudgingly held it. But to Eli, it was his. The dollar he had paid was less than the cost of a meal in town, yet what he carried now was worth more than any coin he had ever spent. He reined in at the edge of the yard, studying the house with a mixture of caution and resolve. The windows stared back at him, dark and watchful, as though they were not entirely empty. A chill worked its way up his spine, the kind that comes when the air feels too still, when the silence presses too heavy. Eli shook it off and dismounted, his boot sinking into soil that hadn't been tended in far too long. He told himself it was nothing, only nerves. But as he set foot on the warped boards of the porch, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house was already waiting for him. He reached into his pocket and touched the deed again, the seal rough under his fingertips. $1 had bought him a ranch, but he would soon learn it had bought him more than that. Because behind those shadowed windows, inside that hollow house, someone was already there. Someone who had claimed it long before the county ever signed it away. The ranch looked older up close, as though the years of neglect had sunk into its bones and bowed the wood with secrets it no longer cared to keep hidden. Eli stood in the yard, reins loose in his hand, staring at the sagging house that now carried his name on paper. The shutters hung crooked, one banging lazily against the siding in the faint wind. Weeds had swallowed the fence line, and the corral looked more like a tangle of dead branches than anything meant to hold livestock. Still, as he let his horse graze by the dry well, he felt that familiar stirring in his chest, the one that said ruin could be turned into shelter if a man was stubborn enough. The porch complained when he set his weight on it, boards creaking like an old man's joints. Dust coated the railing, his fingers leaving clean streaks when he touched it. The door gave beneath his hand with a reluctant groan, opening into a hush that was thick enough to muffle even his own footsteps. Light filtered through cracked panes and torn curtains, falling in slanted bars across the floorboards. Dust rose in lazy swirls with every breath of air, turning the room into a haze of shifting gold. For a moment, Eli thought the house was exactly what he expected. Empty, forgotten, a shell waiting to be filled again. But then he felt the unmistakable sense that something, someone, lingered inside. It wasn't sound, not at first. It was the way the air carried warmth where it should have been cool, the way the silence seemed strained, as though listening back at him. His hand hovered near the small knife on his belt, more out of instinct than fear, and he moved carefully across the warped planks. He passed a table missing one leg, its surface cluttered with things no county auctioneer would have left behind. A tin mug, a blanket folded neatly, though worn thin. A loaf of bread so fresh the scent still clung to it. Eli froze, heart tightening. The house wasn't empty. He wasn't alone. The sound came then soft, deliberate, a footstep on the boards above him. Eli looked toward the narrow staircase in the corner, its railing bowed and gray. Before he could call out, a shadow moved against the light spilling from an upstairs window, and then she appeared. She came down the stairs barefoot, each step measured, eyes fixed on him as though she'd known he was coming. The girl was young, maybe his age, though her face carried the thin sharpness of someone who had stretched too many meals too far. Her hair was long and tangled, her dress faded but mended in careful places. She stopped halfway down, the stair creaking under her weight, and stared at him with an expression caught between defiance and exhaustion. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her voice low but steady. Eli blinked, words catching in his throat. "I bought this place," he managed finally, lifting the edge of the deed from his pocket as if proof could make the strangeness vanish. $1, signed at the courthouse this morning. The girl's eyes flicked to the paper but didn't soften. "That may be what the county told you, but I've been living here." Her gaze held his like a challenge, sharp enough to cut through the dust-filled light. Eli saw then the way her shoulders squared, how she stood ready to bolt or to fight, depending on his next move. She wasn't some fragile trespasser clinging to the last scraps of comfort. She was rooted here, as much a part of the ranch as the leaning porch and the wind-shaken shutters. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure whether to insist or apologize. This was supposed to be his beginning, his chance to lay claim to land and life. Yet standing in the hollow house, with the girl's dark eyes fixed on him, Eli realized the deed in his pocket hadn't bought emptiness at all. It had bought complication, flesh and blood, and a story that hadn't yet been told. The dust swirled higher in the beam of sunlight between them, two strangers caught in the stillness of a place both of them now called home. Clara May came the rest of the way down the stairs, her bare feet soundless on the worn boards. She kept her chin high, though Eli could see the guarded tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself like a cornered animal that would sooner bite than retreat. He stayed where he was, one hand resting against the folded deed in his pocket, as though it were a weapon or a shield. "This house is mine now," he said carefully, trying to steady the weight of his voice. "I paid the county for it. Legal deed. Signed and stamped." Her eyes flicked to his hand but didn't falter. "Paper doesn't make it yours. I've been here since my daddy died, 2 winters ago." She crossed her arms, defiance sharpening every line of her face. "That's longer than any county man ever cared." Eli's brow furrowed. "You've been here, alone? All this time?" Clara nodded once, short and hard, as though daring him to call her a liar. "Nowhere else to go. Nowhere else I'd want. My daddy left debts behind, and the bank men came to strip what little we had. Took the cattle, took the wagon, even tried to take the stove. But they didn't take me. I stayed. And when the county came poking around, I hid until they left again. Far as I'm concerned, this ranch has been mine since the day he drew his last breath." Eli shifted, the boards groaning beneath his boots. He wanted to believe her. Something in her voice carried a truth that couldn't be rehearsed, but the paper in his pocket burned hot against his palm. "I don't doubt you've been here," he said, softer now. "But the deed says different. Whatever the county knew, whatever they didn't know, they sold it, and I bought it." Clara's eyes narrowed, a flash of anger sparking there. "So you think $1 makes you more rightful than me?" The words hit him sharper than he expected. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then steadied himself. "It makes me the owner in their eyes. That's the law." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "Law. Law's what left me with nothing but 4 walls and a roof that leaks every time it rains. Law's what said I was worth less than the debts my father drank into the ground. If law means I should leave the only place I've managed to survive, then maybe law isn't worth much." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Dust drifted between them in golden shafts of sunlight, and outside a loose shutter banged against the wall like a drum beat marking their silence. Eli studied her, really looked at her, the ragged hem of her dress stitched and restitched by her own hand, the hollows beneath her cheekbones, the stubborn pride in the set of her jaw. She was no thief squatting in luxury. She was a survivor, clinging to a place that had given her nothing but walls to shelter her grief. "I'm not here to throw you out," Eli said finally, his voice quieter than before. "But this land is mine now. I can't pretend otherwise." Clara's gaze softened just enough to betray the weariness beneath her fire. "And I can't pretend I don't belong here. So what does that make us?" Eli had no answer. Only the knowledge that the deed in his pocket and the determination in her eyes were on a collision course, and that neither one of them seemed ready to yield. The town of Dry Creek had a way of chewing on news until it lost all its flavor, and then chewing some more. Eli had known the moment he laid his coin on the courthouse counter that whispers would follow him out the door, but he hadn't counted on how quickly they would swell into laughter, speculation, and half-truths. By the second morning, when he rode in to fetch nails and a sack of oats, the Dollar Ranch was on every tongue. He felt it before he even hitched his horse outside the general store, the shift in silence when he stepped onto the boardwalk, the way conversations dimmed just enough to let his ears catch the tail end of his own name. Eli Barrett, fool enough to buy land cursed dead and dry. Eli Barrett, with his papers in order but his head in the clouds. Some voices carried pity, others mockery, and all of them stung like grit against raw skin. Inside the store, the air smelled of flour and lamp oil, dust settling in the high beams overhead. Mr. Whitaker, behind the counter, greeted him with the kind of courtesy that stretched too thin to hide curiosity. 2 men by the barrel of beans elbowed each other, one muttering loud enough for Eli to catch. "Paid $1 for more trouble than he can carry." The other chuckled, adding, "Heard he's not alone out there." "Either. Squatter girl living in the house before he even signed the deed." Eli kept his jaw tight, shoulders squared, and focused on the list in his head. Nails, flour, oats, rope, nothing more. He told himself he didn't care what they said, but their words followed him down the aisle like hounds at his heel. By the time he reached the counter, the room behind him buzzed with speculation about the girl, about what sort of arrangement he must have struck, about how long before the sheriff got involved. He kept his answers short when Whitaker asked if he needed credit, sliding a few hard-earned bills across the counter instead. Better to let money speak where pride could not. With his goods packed into a burlap sack, Eli left without looking back, but he felt the eyes trail him all the way to the hitching post, as though the town itself had branded him reckless for daring to claim what others had already judged a failure. It was later that same day, as the sun slid lower and shadows stretched long across Main Street, that he saw her. Clara May stood at the side counter in the store, her hair pulled back in a rough braid, her dress washed but threadbare. She held a bundle of dried herbs tied with twine, setting them down before Mrs. Whitaker with a kind of stubborn dignity that made Eli pause in the doorway. "I'll trade for flour," Clara said, her voice steady. "These will steep for fevers, stronger than the powders you sell." Mrs. Whitaker frowned, skeptical, but she weighed the bundle in her hand all the same. Eli watched the exchange quietly, noting how Clara stood barefoot on the worn boards, shoulders squared, unflinching beneath the curious stares of the other customers. There was no shame in her posture, no apology, only grit, the kind a person carried after weathering too many nights alone with nothing but hunger for company. When Mrs. Whitaker finally measured out a small sack of flour in exchange, Clara accepted it with a nod, as though the trade had been fair and square. She turned to leave, eyes meeting Eli's for a fraction of a second at the door. In that brief glance, he saw not the squatter the town whispered about, nor the burden the gossip painted her to be. He saw someone who refused to bow, who scraped survival from the bones of a place everyone else had written off as dead. Eli stepped aside to let her pass, the murmurs of the townsfolk rising again behind them. But this time, instead of shame prickling hot across his skin, he felt something else, something quieter, steadier. Recognition. Clara May might not have a deed in her pocket, but she carried something heavier, a claim written in grit, in stubbornness, in the unspoken vow that she would not be erased. And standing there, sack of oats over his shoulder, Eli realized that whatever the town thought, the ranch was no longer his alone. The storm rolled in sudden, the way storms often did in the valley, black clouds spilling over the ridge like a curtain being drawn across the sky. By nightfall, rain hammered the earth in sheets so heavy that Eli could barely see the outlines of the corral through the window. Wind whipped against the house, pulling at loose boards, rattling the shutters until it seemed the whole place might lift up and scatter. He lay awake listening to it, counting heartbeats between the growl of thunder and the crack of lightning. When dawn finally pushed through, pale and hesitant, he stepped outside into a world torn open. The corral fence lay half collapsed, posts ripped loose where the ground had turned to muck. Rails floated crooked in the mud, and the earth was scarred with deep channels where water had surged through. Eli cursed under his breath, dropping his sack of tools by the ruin. He set his shoulders against a post, heaved, and managed to lever it upright, but his boots sank to the ankles, every movement sucking strength from him. He tried again, jaw tight, sweat stinging his eyes even in the cool of morning. The post shifted, but his arms shook under the weight, and it slid back into the mud before he could wedge it straight. He was still wrestling with it when a shadow fell across the churned earth. Clara May stood a few feet away, her braid damp from the rain, dress streaked with mud. She didn't say a word at first, only watched him struggle. Eli straightened, breath hard in his chest, and reached for the sledgehammer. "I've got it," he said, though the quiver in his arms betrayed him. Without answering, Clara stepped forward and took the hammer from his hands. Her grip was easy, practiced, like someone who had been swinging tools longer than she'd been cooking meals. She drove the head down against the softened ground, setting the post straight with a single sure blow. The sound cracked through the air, sharp and final. Eli blinked, surprised by the force in her movements, the way her muscles flexed as though the weight of the tool was no more than a broom handle. Together they worked without speaking, Eli holding the posts in place while Clara struck them deep into the mud, each swing driving the wood solid. He stretched the rails, she steadied them, and the broken corral began to take shape again. Their breathing fell into rhythm, movements fitting together like pieces of a pattern neither of them had known they could share. The morning slipped by in grunts and the dull thud of hammer against earth, until the fence once again stood whole. When it was done, Eli leaned against the corner post, mud streaking his trousers, sweat cooling on his brow. Clara wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge across her cheek. For a long moment, they simply looked at the line of repaired wood, the order restored where chaos had clawed through. Eli found himself studying her not as an intruder in his home, but as something else entirely. She wasn't just surviving here on scraps and stubbornness. She was strong, capable in a way that filled the gaps he hadn't known how to bridge. The storm had left its mark on the land, but in its wake, something unexpected had settled between them, a rhythm, steady and unspoken, like the beat of work done side by side. And for the first time since he'd paid his dollar for the ranch, Eli felt that maybe he hadn't bought it alone. The first Eli knew of trouble was the sound of snapping rails, sharp as gunshots carried on the wind. He dropped his bucket by the well and ran toward the pasture, boots sinking deep in sodden earth. When he crested the rise, his heart sank. A massive bull, black hide shining with sweat, stood in the middle of his field, head low, nostrils flaring like twin smokestacks. The beast had torn through the fence on the north side, trampling the young shoots of corn Eli had planted only a week before. Each step crushed the soil flat, months of hope ground under heavy hooves. He grabbed a length of rope from the fence and swung it clumsily, shouting as he edged forward. The bull raised its head, horns curving wicked against the gray morning sky, and let out a bellow that made Eli's insides tighten. He tried again, snapping the rope to drive it back, but the animal only snorted, pawing the earth, the promise of violence clear in every tense muscle. By then, neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Men leaned on fence rails, women clutching their shawls, children wide-eyed at the sight of chaos on Barrett's land. Eli heard someone laugh, low and sharp. "Dollar ranch, dollar luck," the voice carried, the words cutting deeper than the ruined pasture. He swallowed hard and tried again, circling, rope flicking against the air. The bull lunged once, sending him stumbling backward, boots sliding in the churned mud. A chorus of gasps rippled through the onlookers. His chest heaved, rope slack in his hand, the truth settling heavy. He was outmatched. Then Clara appeared. She came down the slope at a steady walk, braid swinging against her back, eyes fixed on the animal with a calm that seemed impossible in the face of so much raw fury. Eli opened his mouth to warn her, but she lifted one hand, silencing him without looking his way. She stepped to the edge of the trampled corn and stood still, measuring the bull with a gaze sharp as any blade. Her voice, when it came, was low and steady, carrying just enough to reach the animal's ears without breaking the air. "Easy now, big fella. You've wandered far enough." She moved slowly, each step deliberate, body angled so she looked neither like predator nor prey. The bull's head swung toward her, ears twitching, its stance shifting from threat to wary attention. The crowd hushed. Eli found himself holding his breath as Clara lifted her arms, wide but unhurried, guiding the beast not with force but with presence. She sidestepped, small movements that opened a path toward the broken fence. Her words never stopped, a stream of rhythm and reassurance, until the animal's heaving breaths began to ease. With a toss of its head, it turned, grudging but yielding, and lumbered toward the gap it had made. Clara walked behind it, never closer than a few paces, her voice, the steady tether that pulled the bull back across the boundary line. When it finally crossed, she gave a sharp clap, startling it into a trot that carried it out of their pasture and onto its own. Then she lowered her arms, wiped the sweat from her brow, and turned back toward the staring neighbors. No one spoke for a moment. Then the whispers began, quick and sharp. The girl at Barrett's ranch. Tamed it like it was nothing. Never seen the likes of it. Faces that had come eager to witness Eli's failure now flicked between him and Clara with something closer to awe than mockery. Eli stood frozen, rope limp at his side, as Clara strode past him toward the house. She did not look triumphant, only steady, as though guiding a bull twice her size back across a field was no more remarkable than mending a fence. But Eli knew better. He had watched her take command of danger without hesitation, had seen the animal obey her where he himself had failed. And though the whispers in the crowd followed her name, it was the silence in his chest that spoke loudest of all, the certainty that Clara May was more than the valley had reckoned with, and more than he had ever expected. The fire burned low in the hearth, a soft orange glow that painted the walls with shadows shaped by memory more than flame. Eli sat with his boots stretched toward the warmth, the weight of the day pressing against his bones. Outside, the valley lay hushed under a blanket of stars, the only sound the slow drip of water from the eaves after the storm. Clara sat across from him, knees drawn up beneath her patched skirt, her eyes fixed on the flames as though they held something only she could see. For a long while neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't hostile, but thick, filled with everything unsaid between them. Eli shifted in his chair, thinking of the bull, of the neighbors whispering her name with awe, of how she had stood where he faltered. He wanted to thank her, but gratitude seemed too small a word for what he had seen. Before he could find the right shape for his thoughts, Clara's voice broke the quiet. "My daddy used to sit just there," she said, tilting her chin toward the chair where Eli now rested. When the nights were long and he hadn't yet poured enough whiskey to forget himself, he'd sit and stare at the fire the same way you are now. Eli straightened, unsure whether to move or hold still. Clara's eyes didn't leave the flames. "He wasn't always a drunk," she went on. "When Mama died, he tried. For a while he tried to keep the ranch going. We had a few head of cattle left, some corn that still grew, but the bottle was easier than the field. Easier than looking me in the face and remembering what he'd lost." Her hands, folded loosely in her lap, tightened until her knuckles whitened. "By the time I was 16, the debts were taller than the corral posts. Men came with papers, men who didn't care about anything but collecting what was owed. They took the cattle, the tools, even the stove. I hid while they loaded wagons, watched from the loft like a mouse while they stripped the house bare. When it was over, Daddy was gone too. Some said he left with them. Others said he wandered out past the ridge and never came back. I never saw him again." Eli swallowed, the crackle of the fire loud in the pause she left. He wanted to speak, but she pressed on, her words steady though her voice was quiet. "I spent that first winter sleeping wherever I could. Barns when the weather was kind, empty attics when I could slip inside unseen. Some nights, just the open ground. Folks in town knew, but they turned their faces away. Nobody wanted the burden of a girl with nothing." She glanced at him then, sharp and brief, as though daring him to look away too. Eli held her gaze, the weight of her story settling heavy across his chest. The deed in his pocket felt like a lie compared to the years she carried. "In the spring I came back," Clara said. "The house was falling apart, but it was mine in a way no one else wanted. I patched the roof as best I could, mended what I had to, and made do. When the county men came to inspect, I learned how to hide, behind the barn wall, beneath the floorboards once. They never looked too close, why would they? To them, this place was just a ruin." Her voice softened, though the steel never left it. "But to me, it was still home. Even broken, it was all I had left of them." The fire shifted, a log collapsing into embers. Eli watched the glow flicker across her face, carving the lines of weariness that came from years of shouldering more than one person should. He thought of the dollar he had paid, how he had walked away from the courthouse smug with a bargain. Yet now he sat in a house heavy with ghosts, a house that belonged to her long before he ever laid eyes on it. For the first time, doubt crept in. Maybe the ranch was hers in a way no paper could prove. Maybe he was the intruder, clutching his deed like proof against something that did not care for ink or stamps. Clara leaned back, eyes finally leaving the fire. "That's the truth of it," she said, her voice nearly a whisper. "You may own it now, but I've lived it. Every rotten board, every leaking seam. It's carved into me, same as the land." Eli nodded slowly, unable to muster an argument. The paper in his pocket seemed thin, meaningless. He looked at her barefoot, scarred by years of loss, yet unbroken, and for the first time since stepping onto the ranch, he wondered not if she belonged, but if he did. The sheriff came on horseback just after noon, the sun high and sharp in a cloudless sky. Eli saw the dust trail first, curling up from the ridge like smoke, and felt his stomach knot before the rider even drew close. By the time the man reined in at the edge of the yard, Eli had set down his tools and wiped his hands on his trousers, heart thudding with a kind of dread he hadn't known since the day he signed the deed. Sheriff Holt was a broad man, older, his face lined from years of riding the circuit between town and homesteads. His badge glinted in the light, polished brighter than the rest of him, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who rarely had to raise his voice. He dismounted without hurry, dust settling over his boots, and reached into his saddlebag. "Barrett," he said, his tone even, though not unfriendly. "Got business with you." Eli nodded, trying to keep his own voice steady. "What kind?" The sheriff pulled a folded stack of papers free, creases worn soft from handling. He handed them over, watching Eli's face as he read. The words swam for a moment, but the meaning was clear enough. Eviction notice, unauthorized occupancy, no legal rights of residence. Clara May's presence, spelled out in ink as though she were nothing more than an item to be cleared from a ledger. "She's been living here," Eli said quietly, the paper trembling between his fingers. Holt adjusted his hat, eyes narrowing. "That may be, but she's got no claim. County sold this ranch clean, $1 and done. If she stays under your roof, it could raise questions." "Folks already talking. Best to set things straight before they get messy." The words pressed like weights against Eli's chest. He felt the eyes of the town again, their whispers about the squatter girl, their laughter at the fool who bought cursed land. The easy path lay plain before him. Say nothing, let the sheriff handle it, keep the ranch for himself and avoid the fight. But when he looked past Holt's shoulder to the house, where the curtains stirred faintly in the open window, he thought of Clara's story by the fire, of the ghosts she carried, of the way she had faced down a bull with nothing but her voice. "This place isn't empty," Eli said, his voice firmer than he expected. "Not anymore." The sheriff studied him, waiting. "It's ours," Eli went on, surprising himself with the weight of the word. "She's lived here longer than I have, put more of herself into these walls than I've managed yet. You can say she's got no right, but I won't send her packing. Not now, not ever." The silence that followed stretched long, broken only by the restless snort of Holt's horse. The sheriff chewed on the inside of his cheek, then finally gave a slow nod. "You'll be the one shouldering it if trouble comes. County won't thank you for defiance." "I'll shoulder it," Eli answered. Holt folded the papers back into his saddlebag, mounted, and with a tug on the reins turned toward town. Dust swallowed him as he disappeared down the road, leaving Eli standing in the yard with his pulse hammering and his throat dry. He hadn't planned those words, hadn't weighed the risk. They had simply risen out of him, solid and certain as if they'd been waiting all along. When he turned back toward the house, Clara was standing in the doorway. She must have heard every word. Her expression, usually so guarded, had softened, a flicker of something he hadn't seen before glinting in her eyes. Trust, tentative but real, like a flame catching after too many failed strikes of flint. She didn't speak, only gave the smallest nod before stepping aside, as though to say he had earned his place inside as much as she had. Eli crossed the porch, the boards groaning under his weight, and for the first time since the deed had passed into his hands, he felt the ranch belonged to them both. The weeks stretched out in a rhythm neither of them had expected. What had begun as wary coexistence turned slowly into something steadier, shaped by long days of labor and the quiet silences that filled the spaces between. Morning light found Eli bent over the ledger, his neat handwriting tallying seed costs and projecting crop yields, while Clara leaned against the table, arms crossed, her brow furrowed in concentration. Numbers were never her comfort, but she listened, asked questions, learned how rows in a book could steady a ranch as surely as rows in the field. In return, she led him out into the pastures with a rope in her hand and patience in her step, showing him how to read the flick of an ear, the set of a tail, the subtle signs that marked an animal's mood before it ever turned dangerous. Together they patched fences, tilled soil, and set new posts straight against the sky. Clara showed him the narrow trails that wound behind the hills, places where grass stayed green even in dry months, and where a man could find shelter when storms rolled sudden from the west. Eli taught her how to keep track of every nail and hinge, how to spread seed by measure instead of guesswork, how to stretch supplies so the pantry never ran empty. Each lesson was shared without pride, only the understanding that both of them were stronger for the giving. At night, when the work was done, they sat on the porch with the air cooling around them, the horizon painted in the colors of fire fading into ash. They didn't always speak, but the silence was different now. It wasn't heavy, wasn't wary. It was the kind of silence that carried comfort, as though both knew the other's presence was enough. It was during those quiet evenings that Eli began carving. From a fallen piece of oak he had gathered after the last storm, he cut a small band, shaping it with careful strokes. Each night after Clara had gone inside, he stayed on the porch with his knife and sandpaper, smoothing the surface until it gleamed like polished amber. He thought of her as he worked, not the fierce girl who had defied the sheriff, not the stranger who had once looked ready to bite when he showed her the deed, but the woman who had met him in the fields, side by side, equal in sweat and effort. The day came when the ring was ready. He held it in his palm as the sun dipped behind the hills, its glow catching the grain of the oak. Clara was sitting at the porch rail, braid falling loose over her shoulder, her bare feet brushing the last warmth from the boards. Eli's throat tightened as he crossed the few steps between them. "I made something," he said, voice rough from nerves he couldn't quite shake. She turned, curious, and he held out the small wooden band. Her eyes softened as she lifted it from his palm, turning it carefully between her fingers. "You carved this?" He nodded. "From the oak by the fence line. Took me near 3 weeks." She slipped it onto her finger, the fit snug but not too tight. For a moment she only looked at it, then at him, something unreadable in her gaze. Eli swallowed hard, steadying himself. "I don't want you here as a squatter, Clara," he said, the words carrying more weight than he realized until they were spoken. "Not as someone the county looks past, or someone I happen to find living under this roof. I want you here as my wife, as my partner. Stay not because you've nowhere else to go, but because you choose to." The air seemed to still, the evening hush deepening around them. Clara's eyes glistened with something she didn't let fall, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the steadiness of all the storms she had already weathered. "You mean it?" "With everything I've got," Eli said. She looked down at the ring once more, then back at him. And when she nodded, slow and certain, the quiet promise of dusk felt less like an ending and more like the beginning of something neither of them had dared believe possible. The seasons turned, carrying the valley from the brittle heat of summer into the crisp gold of autumn. 6 months had passed since Eli first rode through the broken gate with a deed folded in his pocket and doubts heavy in his chest. Where weeds once clawed through cracked soil, rows of corn now swayed in the wind, green and full. The fences, once sagging, stood straight and tight, rails firm under the strain of cattle that grazed calmly within. The roof no longer leaked when it rained, and smoke curled steady from the chimney each evening, marking the house not as a hollow shell, but as a home alive with warmth. Eli worked the fields with measured care, each task thought through, each ledger balanced. Clara moved among the livestock, her steady hands and sharp eyes keeping even the most stubborn animal in line. Where one faltered, the other carried. Their strengths meshed so naturally that soon the rhythm of the ranch seemed to belong to them both. Each decision, each repair, each plan built on quiet partnership. Word traveled fast in Dry Creek. The place they had once mocked as cursed began to draw curious eyes. Neighbors who had laughed over whiskey about Eli's dollar purchase now found excuses to ride by, tipping their hats at the sight of healthy pastures and sturdy fences. Some stopped to ask questions they never thought they'd voice about soil rotation, about keeping cattle calm through storms, about how Eli and Clara had managed to wring life from ground everyone else had given up on. Eli answered as best he could, but often it was Clara who stepped forward, explaining with quiet authority the signs she looked for in animals, the care needed to prevent sickness, the tricks her father once taught her about reading the land. The same townsfolk who had whispered "squatter girl" now nodded in respect, leaving with more than advice. They left with the uneasy recognition that strength wore many faces. Not all of them the ones they had been raised to expect. When the day came for vows, the little church on the hill filled with neighbors, their curiosity tempered now by something closer to admiration. Sunlight poured through the windows, catching dust motes that swirled like gold above the wooden pews. Eli stood at the front, his hands steady though his heart pounded, and when Clara entered, the murmurs rose then hushed, the whole town seeming to hold its breath. She wore a simple dress, mended and pressed, her braid woven with a ribbon the color of late summer wheat. On her finger rested the oak ring Eli had carved, resized to fit perfectly, its grain polished by months of wear. They spoke their vows without hesitation, words simple and unadorned, but heavy with the truth of what they had built together. Promises of honor, of shared burdens, of standing side by side, no matter what storms came, promises they had already been keeping long before the preacher gave them form. When the service ended, the crowd filed out into the crisp October air, and Samuel Morrison, who once smirked at Eli's chances, clasped his shoulder with something like respect. The ranch they returned to that evening no longer bore the weight of abandonment. It had been rebuilt board by board, furrow by furrow, laughter stitched into its seams alongside sweat and determination. What a dollar had bought was not land, not walls, not a failing legacy. It was the chance for two people broken by loneliness to find in each other a partner, a home, and a love strong enough to root itself in the hardest soil and flourish. And as the lantern light glowed against the windows, spilling across the yard into the autumn night, the house that had once stood hollow now pulsed with life, reborn by their hands, and theirs alone.